Let's talk for a moment about Purim, the story of Purim. We all know that there was a wicked king by the name of Ahasuerus, and he had his wife killed, and then he was lonely, so he made a beauty contest and chose from all the women in the kingdom, and he picked Esther, who was the beauty queen, supposedly. And then there was Haman, who was a descendant of Amalek, and he wanted to wipe out all the Jews. And then there was Mordechai, who found out about Haman's plan and warned Esther, and Esther got the king to cancel the decree and to defeat Haman. That's the story as we read it, as we understand it, as we're told in song and in plays and so on. But the rest of the story, let's find out what the meaning of Purim really is and what we're supposed to learn from all of these characters and from the holiday itself. Firstly, the Megillah, the story of Purim, is called the Book of Esther. Now, Mordechai, who was her uncle, who was her mentor, who was the leader of the Jewish people at the time, was certainly a hero, an active participant in this whole story, in the Megillah. Why isn't the Megillah called the Megillah of Mordechai, the Book of Mordechai? Why isn't it at least called the Book of Mordechai and Esther, or Esther and Mordechai? Yet the Torah chooses for itself, the Book of Esther being a book of Torah, the Torah chooses the title, the Book of Esther, Megillas Esther. So we need to understand why that is. Also, the Baal Shem Tov taught that if you read the Megillah as if it were an old story, an ancient story, something that happened a long time ago, then you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of celebrating Purim and of reading the Megillah. Rather, the Megillah has to be read as a current, relevant, immediately practical message for ourselves, for our lives, for our times. And that's in fact true of any story in Torah. Because in the lives of the people that we read about, any name, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, David, Moshe, there were so many events in their lives, and they lived long and rich lives. And yet the Torah doesn't record the vast majority of incidents and events of their lives. We have only a few incidents in the lives of Moshe, a few incidents in the lives of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Why are these few incidents, these few stories recorded in Torah when all the rest is not? It's because these stories, the ones that the Torah tells us about, were not only an event in the life of an individual, but it is the story of the Jewish people. And it's consistent, it makes sense, that incidents that happened to the fathers of a nation are really the story of the history of the nation in capsule form. Maaseh Avos Siman Labonim. The events of the parents is an indication of what's to come for the children. Same is true also with the story of the Megillah. The story of the Megillah is recorded and made eternal in Torah because it has an eternal relevance. It has an eternal message, not just a detail, but actually describing the existence, the meaning, the purpose of who we are. So when we celebrate Purim, we're not celebrating an event that happened a long time ago. We're actually reliving or living out what the Megillah tells us and what the story of Esther began and we are completing in our own lives. If we put the story of Purim in context, this was the first time that the Jewish people were in exile after having settled into Israel and having built the Beis Hamikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. This was their first experience with exile. We are still in exile today. So obviously we're living through the same experience. We're going through the same challenges, and we need to know from the story of Esther how to handle this. The Gemara says, why was it that the Jews of that generation, of that time, deserved to have such a terrible decree hanging over their head? Haman wanted to wipe out every Jew, all Jews. Why? What was it that brought this decree against the Jewish people? And the Gemara says, the decree came because Ahasuerus made this big party. The king of Persia made this big party, and he invited everyone, all his subjects, including the Jewish people, and the Jews went and enjoyed the party. That's why they deserved this decree. That's what brought about this decree. Now, whatever it was that happened at the party, and there were some things that weren't exactly kosher. Firstly, the vessels, the things that they had stolen from the temple, from the Beis Hamikdash, were being used at this party. And of course, those vessels were not meant to be used for any other purpose other than the Beis Hamikdash, so it was a sacrilege. It wasn't right to use those vessels outside of the temple. There are those who say that the food wasn't kosher, although that's questionable because the Megillah itself says that Ahasuerus made sure that everyone had the food that they preferred or that they chose, so that the food was kosher enough even for Mordechai. But whatever the sin might have been, whether it was non-kosher food or using the vessels from the temple, do any of these sins deserve such an incredibly harsh punishment to have an entire people wiped out? Men, women, and children. Obviously not. So Chassidus gives the explanation that what the Gemara means, that the Jews deserved this decree because they enjoyed the party, is not because of any sin that they committed at the party, but because of a natural process where the Jews who found themselves for the first time in exile at the mercy of this king who ruled over 127 countries, Ahasuerus, they were in a quandary. They didn't know how to handle exile. They didn't know what to depend on. They didn't know how to see their future, what to look forward to. When Ahasuerus sent out the invitation and included the Jewish people, which meant that he was not an anti-Semitic leader, that he was going to be benevolent to the Jewish people, this reassured the Jews, made them feel much more secure, and they went to the party and enjoyed it, meaning that they enjoyed the security that they believed Ahasuerus offered. With him being friendly to the Jews, they felt that their survival was guaranteed. In other words, they trusted in him for their survival. Of course, Haman came along, changed Ahasuerus' mind, and Achashverosh turned out to be the enemy. So what we learn from this very, very clear and brutal lesson is that we can't depend for our existence, for our survival. We can't depend on humans. We can't depend on people who are fickle, as was Achashverosh, particularly Achashverosh, because, in fact, his name wasn't Achashverosh at all. Achashverosh is not a name, and that's why you don't find that name anywhere in history books. The Gemara says that people called him Achashverosh behind his back, and that in Persian, Achashverosh meant a pain in the head, a headache, because he gave people headaches. With being so fickle and changing his mind constantly, no one knew what to expect, and you came away with a headache. So Achash means a feeling, a sensation, and Rosh means in the head. So Achash V'Rosh means a pain in the head. Of course, they didn't call him that to his face. So Achashverosh was a very fickle individual, wasn't really fit to be king. He had no royal blood in him, which is why he was jealous of his wife Vashti, who did have royal blood, and eventually he had her killed, as the Megillah tells us. And that's why he was paranoid about Haman trying to take over the throne. He was paranoid about maybe not having done the right thing by Mordechai when Mordechai saved his life, and that's why he wanted to reward him and parade him through the streets, because he was afraid that if he doesn't show gratitude, he will lose the throne. He was constantly paranoid because he wasn't fit to be a king. So to place our trust in a human being who has his own problems, who has his own survival worries, is obviously a fatal mistake. And so we learned from the story of Purim, from the story of the Megillah, that exile is not a time when we depend on others, when we start to feel inferior or helpless and need to trust in human beings. It is merely a test of our faith, and the right response, the only response, is that we survive because we're connected to God and not because we have friends in high places. So again, when the Gemara says that the reason the Jewish people had this threat hanging over them in the time of Purim is because they went to the party, is not because of any sin they committed at the party, but because of an attitude, because of an approach. They felt that their survival was guaranteed because they had friends at the court, at the palace, and God, so to speak, said, well, if that's how you want to survive, try it. See how it works. You're on your own. When we're on our own, it doesn't work very well. So the story goes on to say that Mordechai aroused the Jewish people to the danger. They realized that they can't rely on human beings, and they turned back to God. And once they turned back to God, their survival was again guaranteed by God himself. So it's not just a story that happened a long time ago. It's a story that happens in every generation and to all people, and not only on a mass scale, not only on a public scale, but even on an individual scale. Where do we turn? Where do we hang our trust in a time of trouble? Of course, we have to do whatever it takes to survive. Mordechai was a diplomat. He was a member of the royal court. He used that position to great advantage. He used the fact that Esther was in the palace to great advantage. But above it all, the trust was in God. And that's why when Mordechai asks Esther to go to the king and plead for her people, Esther says, first, let's have a fast. Let's fast. Let's do tshuva. Let's repent. Let's get all Jews aroused and inspired and reawakened in their Judaism. And in that merit, with that strength, then I can use my diplomatic abilities and diplomatic connections to bring about the necessary changes. In fact, there was this discussion between Mordechai and Esther. Mordechai said, "Go to the king and plead for your people." Esther said, "I can't. There's a decree that anyone who enters the royal chamber without being invited is beheaded, and I was not invited." So Mordechai wants to convince Esther to risk her life and go anyway. And he says to her, "Don't try to hide in the palace and think you're safe there. Salvation will come to the Jewish people from one direction or another, from one source or another. But if you don't take the opportunity to do what you can to save the Jewish people, then you will lose an opportunity to do something great. And besides, isn't it possible that this is the reason that you became the queen in the first place? That divine providence put you there specifically for this moment." Esther had been in the palace now for about 10 years. When you read the story in the Megillah, it sounds like it all happened in one weekend. But it was 10 years after Esther was taken to the palace that this conversation took place. So Mordechai is saying to Esther, "I'm not afraid that the Jewish people might not survive. We are guaranteed that we are forever and we will always be, and salvation will come from some other source if you don't go. But look at what you're losing out. Look at what you'd be missing, an opportunity to do something for an entire people." And an even stronger argument, in addition to that, was all of these events, the whole Megillah, the ganze Megillah, with the whole story with the party that Achashverosh made and the killing of his wife Vashti and all the events that happened with Haman and so on and so forth. 10 years of development. All of it meant to put you in this position for this particular moment. If you blow it now, Mordechai was saying, if you blow it now, then everything that happened for the past 10 years will have been wasted, will have been ruined. So Esther said, "I'm convinced. I'll go. But first, proclaim a fast for 3 days." It just so happened that those 3 days were the first days of Pesach, of Passover. So Mordechai said, "We can't proclaim a fast on Pesach. You got to eat matzah. We have to have a Seder." So Esther said, "But what's the point of having a Pesach if there won't be any Jews? What's the point in having commandments when there's no one to fulfill that commandment?" And Mordechai agreed. And they proclaimed that fast. And then Esther went, and Ahasuerus was shocked to find out that she was a Jew and that Haman was trying to harm her people. And then the miracle began to unfold. According to Kabbalah, Mordechai and Esther are 2 parts of the soul, 2 parts of the godly soul. Mordechai is that part of the soul that stays disconnected from the body, bigger than the body, greater than the body. It remains connected to heaven and does not come down completely into the human condition, into the body of who it is. Esther is that part of the soul that does come down into the body. That part of the soul that is absorbed and affected by the body's experiences, by the body's needs, and so on. In simple words, there's a part of the soul that can go into exile, and there's a part of the soul that never goes into exile. And so we see in the story, Esther is taken to the palace. Physically, we think of Esther as a young girl, but the Gemara says that she was in her 60s. She was not a young girl. The miracle, or the fact that Ahasuerus chose her over all other women, is all part of the miracle. Spiritually, Esther represents the part of the soul that comes into the body, that is affected by the body, that responds to the body, and that can experience exile. It can be exiled. So the fact that she is taken to the palace, this is symbolic of the soul going into exile. Mordechai doesn't get taken to the palace. He remains free. But he hovers, just as the part of the soul that is not in the body hovers over the body, concerned with what's happening to the part of the soul that is in the body. So this is a constant, this is always going on in every one of our lives. There's the part of us that is still in heaven, and there's the part of us that is on earth. Esther carries the meaning, the word Esther carries the meaning of hastir astir, concealment, a time of exile. Esther says, I can't go to the king because I'll be beheaded. Mordechai is saying, go to the king for the first time in 10 years. Go to the king willingly. You approach him. Esther had never done that. She was in exile against her will, and she refused to participate in this exile. Here Mordechai says to her, go to the king. Esther says, I can't do that. I would be giving up my whole value system. I would be sacrificing my beliefs. I'd be sacrificing my dignity to go into exile willingly. Mordechai says, everything that has happened until now, the coming down of the soul into the body, the exile from Israel, the destruction of the temple, all of this was leading up to this moment when a Jew has an opportunity to do something great even while in exile. And for the soul to turn around and say, I can't handle exile. I will be good when I'm taken out of exile. I will wait for Mashiach. And then when Mashiach comes, I will do great things. Mordechai says to the soul, the higher part of your soul says to the lower part of your soul, this is not the way to think. Exile is not a mistake. Exile is not a quirk in history. It is the purpose of history. Everything that happened before, the building of the temple, having sacrifices, having all of that, and then having it taken away, all of that was to lead up to this moment in exile where you can do something great for another Jew. And so Esther does. But then she says, fast. Let's make a fast. Let's at least do tshuva. And here Mordechai says no. Mordechai says, no, we can't sacrifice the mitzvah. It's Pesach, we have to eat matzah. And here Esther says, if there are no Jews, there's no need for Pesach. So in the great debate, which comes first, the Jewish people or the Jewish commandments, the Torah or Bnei Yisrael. Here, Mordechai, sitting in heaven, says, no, the commandments come first. But Esther, who has experienced exile, who knows the devotion of the people, says, without the people, there is no point to Pesach. And Mordechai agrees. And so the Megillah is called the story of Esther. This is not a story of what happens in heaven, of Mordechai, not even Mordechai and Esther. This is purely, strictly, a description of a soul in exile, the soul that is in the body, that is subject to the needs and the weaknesses of the body. And it's Esther, that part of the soul in the body, in exile, that can turn everything around and bring to our homes and to our lives great joy, great light, great godliness that is celebrated for all time to come. Because the Gemara says that after Mashiach comes, all other holidays will seem insignificant compared to the holiday of Purim. Because Purim is what it was all about. Purim means succeeding in Golus, succeeding in exile, and then you give meaning and you justify everything that came before. It all leads up to this moment, because for this moment you became a queen. For this moment you were placed in the palace so that you can do something really magnificent. Talking of Purim, celebrating Purim, we're reminded of a story in the Talmud, in the Gemara. The Gemara says that two sages, Rabbi and Reb Zera, celebrated Purim together. And they celebrated intensely. And when they were drunk, Rabbi got up, Rabbi got up and slaughtered Reb Zera. The next day, when Rabbi saw what he had done, he resurrected, he brought Reb Zera back to life. Strange story, but it goes on. The next year, Rabbi invited Reb Zera to come celebrate Purim together. But Reb Zera said, not this year, because miracles don't happen all the time. That's the story. It obviously needs commentary, it needs explanation. Not only does it need to be justified, but it also needs to be explained in such a way that it provides for us a relevant, meaningful, and moral lesson, which is why the Gemara would tell us the story in the first place. The story of Rabbi and Reb Zera is a story about how we serve God responsibly. Meaning to say, there are so many levels on which we can serve God. There's the level of the average person, the simple person, who serves God with sincerity, with obedience, with honesty. Then there is the higher level, let's say, of the Beinoni, who serves God with understanding, with knowledge, with emotion, with insight. Then there's the higher level of the tzaddik, who serves God out of inspiration, out of divine vision. These are all different levels of service, each one appropriate to the people on that level. There are times when we stray. There are times when the simple person tries to serve God on a level higher than is appropriate for him. And the result is usually disastrous. he ends up not serving at all, not even on the way that he was capable of serving. Just as an illustration, there's this well-known story about two men who drove into their shtetl on a Friday afternoon. There was the wealthy man who had hired the wagon, and there was the wagon driver. They both came to the city, to the shtetl, before Shabbos on a Friday afternoon, and they each went off to get ready for Shabbos. On the way to the synagogue, the wealthy man, who was already dressed for Shabbos, noticed that there was a wagon that had slipped off the road and the wheels were stuck in the mud, and they were trying desperately to get the wagon out before sunset. So thinking that he would do a good deed, that he would do a mitzvah, he waded into the mud to try to help drag the wagon out. But of course, he was not a wagon driver. He didn't know how this works. And instead of helping, he just got in the way, got himself muddied, almost killed himself. And when the sun set, the wagon was still in the mud. So he had to go home and change, and he missed the prayer. He missed the services. In the meantime, the wagon driver, who was very poor, had gone on to the synagogue, come to the shul. He had finished the prayers with everybody else. And as was the custom in those days, at the end of the prayers, all the poor men would line up by the door. And as the wealthy homeowners would file out, they would invite the various poor people to their house. Well, the wagon driver was leaving the shul, and he noticed that there were two poor people still standing there. These were the two poor people who would otherwise usually get invited to the home of the wealthy man who was busy trying to pull the wagon out of the mud. So the wagon driver, thinking that he would do a great mitzvah, invited these two poor men to come to his motel room to share the few pieces of bread that he had. Of course, he didn't have enough to feed even himself, and the result was that all three of them remained hungry. So this is a perfect example of people who switched roles in attempting to do a mitzvah. The poor man was doing the rich man's mitzvah. He didn't do it very well. And the rich man was trying to do the wagon driver's mitzvah, and he didn't do that very well. And the result was that the hungry remained hungry, and the wagon remained stuck in the mud. So we see that there are times when we try to serve God in a way that isn't appropriate to us, and we end up doing absolutely nothing. Rabbi and Reb Zera were two different types of people on two different levels of divine service. In fact, their names say it all. Rabbi means great, and Zera means small. So, in their ways of serving God, Rabbi had a way of serving God that was very high, very intense, great. And Reb Zera served God in small ways relative to Rabbi. But when it comes to Purim, we are told that on Purim we are supposed to celebrate, we are supposed to drink until we don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman. Which means to say that we have to rise above our natural level, that we can kind of visit a higher level than what we're capable of during the rest of the year. And this is what it means that Rabbi asked Reb Zera to come celebrate Purim. Rabbi invited Reb Zera up to a higher level of godliness. On that higher level, Reb Zera could not function properly. This was not his natural domain. This was not his environment. This was higher than he could handle, which is perfectly appropriate for Purim. And that's what it means. Come, Rabbi, When Rabbi rose, Rabbi got up, it killed Reb Zera. It means it dragged him up into a level that he couldn't handle normally. But for Purim, that was a great experience. And that's why the Gemara goes on to say that the next day, in other words, when it was no longer Purim, when it was no longer appropriate for Reb Zera to be on a level higher than his own, then Rabbi brought him back to life. Meaning, he brought him back to his own level. And that's why the following year, when Rabbi again invited Reb Zera to come and celebrate, Reb Zera didn't say, I'm not coming because I'm afraid you're going to kill me. He said, I'm afraid I'm not going to get resurrected again. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to come back to my own level after Purim. But the fact that he goes to a level higher than his own on Purim, that's perfectly appropriate. So the meaning of the story is that there are times when it is appropriate for us to step out of our natural level of godliness and taste or experience a level of godliness much higher than our own. On a holiday, on a Purim, on a Simchas Torah, it is okay, it is acceptable, it is quite proper for a Jew to step into a higher level and participate in a godliness that maybe isn't really his own. A person may feel that when Simchas Torah comes around and everybody is celebrating and dancing and rejoicing with the Torah, a person may feel, what right do I have to celebrate the Torah? I don't observe the Torah. I'm not an observant person. I don't practice. I don't keep the commandments of the Torah. Or I don't keep enough of the commandments. Or I don't keep all the commandments. And so for me to celebrate the Torah, for me to dance on Simchas Torah as if this was my celebration, would be inappropriate. So the story in the Gemara tells us that on a holiday, when it's Yom Tov, everything is appropriate. You're invited to participate in a godliness that isn't yours all year round, but it's yours on Yom Tov. After Yom Tov, you go back to your own level. There are times when we feel that we can't observe a commandment, practice a mitzvah, because we don't feel holy enough. There are people who feel that because they don't keep kosher, because they eat non-kosher food, they therefore should not study Torah. Or because they eat non-kosher food, it doesn't make sense for them to observe Shabbos. But again, that's not correct. The holiday elevates us, even when we don't elevate ourselves. And when the holiday elevates, then you can participate in the greater, in the higher level of godliness. This idea that a person can enter a higher level in which he gets disconnected from his lower level and then needs to come back to life, so to speak, is not an unusual occurrence in Jewish life. There's a famous story about a Hasidic Rebbe who was very musical. And he needed to have an operation. But the doctors were afraid of the anesthetic, of the anesthesia. And they told him that they need to do the operation, but they don't want to give him the anesthesia because they're afraid of the effects that that's going to have. So he said, I don't need it. Let me sing a nigun. And when I get into the nigun, then you can perform the operation, I won't feel anything. And so they did. He sang a famous song of his, and they performed the operation, and he felt nothing because he was so absorbed into the tune. He was so absorbed in the nigun, in the music, that he was disconnected from his natural condition, and he didn't feel the physical pain. There's also a story about the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, who was traveling with his father, who was the Rebbe at the time, and they were staying at a hotel. In his diary, the previous Rebbe tells how he left his father sitting on the sofa, lost in thought, and he went out to do some errand. He came back a few hours later, and he found his father in exactly the same position, on the sofa, still lost in thought. This wasn't unusual, so the son didn't disturb his father, went back to his own room, and did whatever he needed to do. And he came back hours later to find that his father was still in that position, very lost in thought. Finally, when he came back a third time, and it was already evening, his father began to ask him questions which were meant to tell the father what day it was and where they were, without asking it outright. The previous Rebbe played along and made like he didn't understand the purpose of the question. He answered the questions and told his father indirectly what day it was and where they were. And that is called klois hanefesh. That's called expiring. When a person gets so lost, so absorbed in something higher, in a godly awareness, in a godly experience, in a godly feeling, that he loses all contact with his physical surroundings to the point where he doesn't know what day it is. He doesn't know where he is. Time and space were lost for a while, and he has to be reintroduced to where he is and what time it is or what day it is. So he has to be reoriented to the physical universe because for a while he had disconnected. And that is the meaning of what happened with Rabbi and Abzeda, and that is how we're supposed to experience Purim. We're supposed to get so absorbed in the celebration of Jewish survival, in the celebration of the miracle of Purim, that for a few hours we're supposed to be completely disconnected, unaware, unconscious of all of our problems, of all of our needs, of all of our physical limitations. We're supposed to rise even above our natural moral standards, where we know that Mordechai is a good guy and Haman is the bad guy, and Mordechai should be blessed and Haman should be cursed. We should rise even above that, even above the distinction between good and bad, right and wrong. We should be so absorbed in what is godly that there is no right and wrong. There's only godliness. There's only goodness. And in that awareness, we celebrate. In that awareness, we fulfill the mitzvah of Purim. And in that way, we relive the entire Megillah. We react, have a flashback to the story of Purim as it happens in our own lives. There's a story about a professor in Israel at the university in Jerusalem. There was a Talmud class, a Gemara shiur, that was given by a very brilliant rabbi in the building where this professor had his office. The class was very popular. It was very enlightening, and all the professors would attend regularly, weekly or whatever it was. But this one professor refused every invitation from his colleagues to come to this Talmud class. It seems that he was a survivor of the war. He had seen his father taken away or killed. He was very disillusioned, very turned off to religion, and refused to participate in a Talmud class. One day the rabbi met the professor at some event. And the rabbi says, you know that we have a class every week for years it's been going on, right there in your department, in your building. Why don't you come? You'll enjoy. Come. The professor says, you don't want me at a Talmud class. I don't belong at a Talmud class. I am not religious at all. And the rabbi persisted and said, it doesn't really matter. You'll come, you'll learn, you'll enjoy. Nobody's asking you to commit yourself to any kind of mitzvahs or observance. Come and study. So the professor said, you don't understand. I am not only non-observant, I am anti-observant. He says, I eat pork on Shabbos, so I don't belong at such a class. The rabbi said, only on Shabbos? You eat pork only on Shabbos? He says, well, I eat pork dafka on Shabbos. So the rabbi said, in that case, Shabbos is special to you as it is to me. So we're not that far apart. You can come to the class. The professor started coming to the class. What the rabbi had actually said, which is really important and meaningful. Why is it that this man chooses to eat pork on Shabbos? Because he's angry at God. And in his anger at God, he wants to lash out. He wants to retaliate. How do you retaliate against God? You pick a holy day and you desecrate it. In fact, you pick the holiest. You choose the holiest day and then desecrate it. It's like a child who wants to punish his parents. He doesn't break a toy. He breaks the mother's favorite vase or piece of crystal. Because he knows where it hurts. He knows what is precious and what will be most painful to destroy. So when a Jew says, I eat pork on Shabbos, it means he chose the holiest day, he chose a sacred day, and out of spite, he is desecrating that holy day. So the rabbi said to him, Shabbos is holy to you. That's why you desecrate it. Shabbos is holy to me. That's why I observe it. So since we have the same holy day, we're not that far apart. You can come and study Talmud. Because what is sacred to me is sacred to you. Only you're in a bad mood about it. But it's still sacred to you. So we see that there is a level of godliness that everybody has, a level of intuitive sense of what is sacred and what is holy. And then we have to know how to handle it. We can either desecrate it or we can celebrate it. We can elevate it or we can degrade it. We can drag it down. The part of us that recognizes that Shabbos is a sacred day, even if we're the type that wants to desecrate it, that part of us that recognizes that Shabbos is a sacred day, that's the holy part. That's like the Yom Tov within us. And when we rise to that level, when we go into the Yom Tov part of us, then we are fully justified and qualified and invited to observe on a higher level, because it belongs to us. It belongs to the holier part of us. So when we step into that higher level, when we enter a Simchas Torah, or we go into a Purim, or whatever holiday it might be, it means that we're coming into contact with what we could call the Mordechai of our soul. The part of our soul that never gets destroyed. The part of our soul that never gets discouraged. The part of our soul that remains absolutely untainted in its Jewishness. And in that part of our soul, we are qualified, we are justified, we are deserving of observing all the mitzvahs, of being as godly as we wish. And we need not hesitate or feel embarrassed to participate in what is our own Jewishness. So, the Mordechai of the soul, the part of the soul that never gets taken to a palace where there is no Judaism, where there is nothing Jewish going on, where Esther, the part of the soul that does go into exile, is the only Jew in town, is the only Jew in the entire palace. The part of the soul that is Mordechai enables, qualifies, justifies the Esther part of our soul to rise to a higher level and to be more heavenly than the environment seems to permit. And so the story of Mordechai and Esther, the story of Purim, is as the story of the Gemara. Rabbi represents that part of the soul that is high. Reb Ze'eda represents the part of the soul that descends, that comes down into the finite, small world. But it's what happens to Reb Ze'eda that counts. Rabbi is the enabler. He enables Reb Ze'eda to rise to a higher level and see a higher perspective when Purim comes around. The trick is to combine the two. There should be no separation. There should be no friction between the part of the soul that is in the body and the part of the soul that is above the body. There's got to be a harmony between them so that every day is a holiday, so that Purim never ends, so that we don't walk away from Purim and leave it behind until next year. We take it with us. And for the rest of the year, we are a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more tuned in, a little bit more inspired than we were before. And in that inspiration, in that additional godliness that we have felt during Purim, the feeling that we get from the Mordechai of our soul, the Esther of our soul, is nourished and supported and elevated so that we do one more mitzvah, a mitzvah that perhaps our parents didn't do, and therefore we never felt qualified. And I can't imagine myself more observant than my parents. And yet, because of the Mordechai of our soul, the Esther of our soul is justified in taking on a new mitzvah, in taking on more Torah study, in trying to understand a higher level of Torah, in moving upwards on the ladder that stands on earth and reaches into heaven. It is ours because there is a part of us that stands on earth, the Esther, and there's a part of us that reaches into heaven, which is the Mordechai. And when Mordechai and Esther get together, then we have a great party. Then we have a great festival. We have a great Purim.